Angie. And thanks everyone so much for coming this afternoon. So today I'm going to be basically providing a bit of a snapshot of key findings from the Sex, Age and Me project, which I've just realised I didn't actually put in the title, which I didn't plan very well. So this project started in 2015, and it was really inspired by some of the Kirby Institute STI surveillance reports from a few years ago now that showed there'd been quite a dramatic increase in the levels of certain STIs amongst the 60 plus population. So we basically wanted to know what might be underpinning this, what's going on here with our older cohort, and just more broadly, how are older Australians approaching sex in later life? Is sex important to them? How does it sort of feature in their lives? How do they understand this concept of sex and so forth? So even though the sort of 60 plus cohort are really a small minority of new STI infections, this is taking place within the context of quite a rapidly aging population. So it's also something that we wanted to look at before it potentially becomes a bigger issue than what it is. And was also taking place in the context of some emerging international research that is really challenging some populist ideas around sex in later life, and particularly this idea that, you hit a certain age and sex just isn't important or doesn't happen anymore. I can get this to go. There we go. Can I use the, yeah. Right, so that's just an overview of what I'll talk about. So we were funded through the Australian Research Council. We had a discovery project. And I also just want to acknowledge the wonderful team of people who have worked on this project. It's certainly not just me. And I should also mention that this project was conducted through La Trobe University. So we had three kind of key aims or objectives. So we wanted to know, well, what are older people getting up to in terms of their sexual practices, their relationships and their dating behaviours as they come into later life. Related to the increase in STIs, more specifically, we wanted to know, are older people using safer sex practices? What sort of safer sex practices are they using? Are there any gaps in their knowledge or understanding of STIs and STI prevention? And finally, where are they going to get help or information if they need it? Okay, so this project involved two key phases. So firstly, it was open to all Australians aged 60 and over. That was the only selection criteria that we used. So the first phase of the project was a survey. So this was mostly conducted online, but there was also a paper version that almost no one elected to do. So we had about 2,200 participants in the survey. We also used the survey to recruit for the interview phase of the study. So I'm just going to be talking about the interview findings today because I'm a qualitative researcher, so I won't be much use talking about the survey. In terms of recruitment, so the survey participants were recruited firstly through the media. So the first week that we launched the survey, we had an article in The Conversation that got picked up by the broader media, and we actually recruited our entire target sample size in the first week. So we then, which was a wonderful position to be in, but we then expanded to recruit through Facebook. So we had some general advertisements as well as some more targeted advertisements to particular demographic groups, and through relevant organisations, so senior, what are they called? Senior citizens clubs, CODA, and so forth. And as I said, the interview participants were all recruited through that survey sample. So there was an option at the end of the survey that said, do you want some information about taking part in an interview? We had about 500 people say that they were interested in taking part. We contacted every third person, and from there we recruited our sample. So the interviews were one-on-one, semi-structured, and were really aimed at generating a more, I guess, nuanced and detailed understanding of how our participants were thinking about sex in later life, and safer sex practices and so on. Okay, so in terms of our sample, so there were 53 participants for this component, 30 men, 23 women. We surprisingly had some challenges recruiting women to take part in the study, which we weren't expecting. The bulk of our participants were heterosexual, so we can really only speak to the heterosexual experience. And they were from a range of different relationship contexts. So as you can see, about 18 were married. That also includes people who were in second and sometimes third marriages, a few in relationships, single, number of people in open or multiple partner relationships. So I'm going to draw on a sexual rights framework today in sort of thinking through some of our findings. So this is from the World Association for Sexual Health, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So I think there are some problems with rights-based approaches, but at the same time, I think this does provide a useful framework or a starting point for thinking through this concept of sexual citizenship and social justice. So I think it does provide some sort of measure or starting point from which we can, consider the extent to which older Australians are being treated in a just manner when it comes to sex and sexuality. Whoops. Sorry, there's about 16 of these rights. I've just highlighted some of the more relevant ones for today's presentation. So certainly the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to autonomy and bodily integrity, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, including sexual health, and the possibility of pleasurable, satisfying and safe sexual experiences, and also the right to information and particularly comprehensive sexuality education, and I'll sort of speak to these throughout the presentation. And I guess I'll be asking or considering to what extent older people's sexual rights are being upheld. So to what extent are older people actually being, recognised as sort of fully fledged sexual citizens in Australia? Okay, so on to some of our key findings. So we wanted to know how our participants were defining or how they understand sex. So what does sex mean to them? What do they sort of think of when they hear this term? So our participants typically fell into these two overarching categories that we've termed hierarchical or fluid definitions. And the way that our participants define sex does have particular importance in considering this right to the possibility for pleasurable and satisfying sexual experiences. And I'll touch on that more in a moment. So for people who held more hierarchical definitions, these were participants who tended to centre on, firstly, the idea that penetrative penis and vagina sex is what constitutes real sex, and other sexual acts are kind of, ordered underneath that in order of how sexual they are. So Finn's comment here is really typical. So sex is a man getting an erection and putting it into a vagina. These participants also tended to have very strict boundaries around what was sexual or not. And this came through in a question about, well, do things like kissing and cuddling, does that count as sex? And these participants tended to say, no, that's sort of outside the bounds of what counts as sex. So our second category of participants had what we called much more fluid definitions of sex. So these participants basically said, sex is virtually any form of behaviour. There's not really clear boundaries between what's sexual and what's not. What counts as sex is much more dependent on the context and the meaning, intent, and outcomes of the behaviours involved. So they were typically much less focused on, like penetration and whatever. It was much, much broader. So for a lot of our participants, what defined sex was much more related to the intent and the meaning behind the encounter, and this relates particularly to these participants who had fluid definitions where sex was really about intimacy and bonding. So it was kind of seen as this natural extension of a relationship. It was a way of, maintaining bonds with your partner, of, being close to your partner, and this physical expression of love. And that wasn't, again, necessarily defined by the particular type of the behavior, but more the intent behind it. And participants' understandings of sex changed over time, so it wasn't necessarily the case that you had this strict hierarchical understanding of sex and that was it for the rest of your life. Some people actually did adjust their understandings of sex across the life course and over time and experience. So, for example, men who experienced erectile difficulties and were suddenly no longer able to engage in penetrative sex might adjust how they define sex and what was important about it. So how participants understood and defined sex did have quite important implications for their ability to, deal with some of the physical changes that can accompany aging and to have pleasurable sexual relationships. So again, for someone who either has erectile dysfunction or difficulties, or women who've gone through menopause and penetrative sex is perhaps painful, if they had these really strict hierarchical definitions of what counts as sex and suddenly you can't engage in that behaviour, then their sexual lives were essentially over, whereas people who had these more fluid definitions were much more able to adapt their sexual practices to kind of accommodate their changing bodies. Okay, so we also asked participants to define safer sex. So what does safer sex mean to you? What do you sort of think of when you hear safer sex? And to talk about the practices that they used in their own sexual lives. And this is, of course, important in terms of considering this right to the highest attainable standard of health and sexual health and the possibility of safe sexual experiences. So firstly, condoms were overwhelmingly what our participants said in terms of what safer sex is and the types of practices that they maybe used, not always, as we'll see in a moment, but condoms were virtually synonymous with safer sex for many, many people. But they certainly weren't used consistently, including in circumstances that presented some risk for STI transmission. So people with casual sexual partners or multiple sexual partners weren't consistently engaging in condom use. And this was particularly the case where people felt that they could trust someone. So trust and relationship context were really central here. So often participants might say, well, I'll use a condom like the first few times I sleep with someone, but then I've kind of figured out that they're all right and I can trust them and we can stop using condoms. So it was almost a kind of going through the motions. So discussing sexual history was used in a few different ways. So for some people, this was used to, talk about, well, do you have any STIs, or have you had any unprotected sex recently? Have you had an STI test recently? Do we need to use condoms? Do we need to go and get tested? But for other people, it was really used as a way of being able to make a value judgment about their partner. So do I think I can trust this person? Do I think they're telling me the truth or not? Do they seem sexually promiscuous? So do they seem like the kind of person who's maybe been a bit loose and can't be trusted? So there were some interesting value and quite moralistic kind of judgments being made. So essentially, they were using this to judge the extent to which they could trust them not to have an STI. So STI tests were not commonly mentioned in terms of participants' definitions of safer sex. So it wasn't really something that people were thinking of when they think safer sex. Some of our participants had actually had STI tests though, so that was perhaps a bit more promising, and particularly participants who'd been dating casually or had multiple sexual partners. They were much more likely to have had an STI test. And interestingly, we also had a few participants who used blood donation as a kind of proxy for an STI test. So a few people saying, oh, well, I had, they tested for, I think it's hepatitis and HIV. So that's good, I'm all clear. Like, my partner works for the blood donation service, and I told him that, and he was horrified. So lower risk sexual practices or changing sexual practices were really only mentioned by a small number of participants. Most notably, the two men who had male sexual partners discussed this, and in particular talked about engaging in lower risk sexual practices for HIV transmission, so not engaging in anal sex in particular. But otherwise, this was really not commonly raised. We did have a few participants say, oh, if I thought someone had an STI, so going back to that value judgment, I just wouldn't have sex with them, I'd call the encounter off. So monogamy came up, and again in a couple of different and interesting ways. So firstly, a lot of our participants had been in long-term monogamous relationships. So they basically just said, well, look, I've been with my partner for 30 years, pretty sure neither of us have slept with anyone else. If someone had an STI, we'd probably know about it by now, which is probably fair enough. But it was also being used by people who were entering into a new relationship with someone who'd been in, serial monogamous relationships, and this assumption that, oh, we've both come from monogamous relationships, so we're fine. We don't need to be tested for STIs. We did have a small number of participants who said they didn't engage in any safer sex practices, again, for a few different reasons. One person who just thought that the risk of STIs was too small to worth worrying about. He said when he was younger, he'd had hundreds of sexual partners and got an STI once, so he figured that the risk, wasn't there. But this also included people who were perhaps embarrassed or unable to negotiate condom use or other forms of safer sex practices with partners. And finally, some of our participants defined safer sex in a much broader way than just STI prevention, and in a way that's perhaps much more in line with the World Health Organization conceptualization of safer sex and sexual health. So for these people, safer sex could include things like taking care of personal hygiene more generally, avoiding bacterial infections, but also taking care of your emotional and psychological well-being within a relationship, and mutual concern for your partner's emotional and psychological well-being. And as I've mentioned, the trust and relationship contexts were essential in shaping all of that. So why weren't people using safer sex practices? So again, embarrassment came up quite a bit. So just feeling unable to say to your partner, or maybe we should use a condom. Some people raised issues around embarrassment at perhaps not knowing how to use different safer sex practices at this stage in your life. So there was the assumption that, oh, you should sort of know better by now. So it was embarrassing to say, I'm actually not sure about this. Erectile dysfunction was also a common one. So for men who had erectile difficulties, sometimes putting a condom on meant that they would lose their erection and they were unable to have sex. So obviously this relates back to, firstly, those hierarchical definitions of sex, so that sex has to involve an erect penis and penetration, but it also relates back to safer sex being synonymous with condom use. So if condoms are what safer sex is and you can't use a condom anymore, then you can't have safer sex. So this lack of skills, experience, and safer sex culture came up quite a bit as well. So for most of our participants, they said, when I was growing up, we didn't have comprehensive sex ed at school. No one spoke to me about sex, or if they did, they just said, don't do it. Condoms were maybe used in certain casual encounters, particularly with like dirty people, loose people, sex workers, again, all those kind of, problematic moralistic judgments, and safer sex was maybe more about pregnancy prevention than STI prevention. So, and in comparison, they thought that young people today have grown up in this culture where they're taught about condoms, they have sex ed in school, so they felt that, I can see Peter making a quizzical face there, but certainly this assumption that for young people, safer sex practices were just an ingrained part of their sexual culture and sexual practice, whereas this older cohort didn't necessarily have that. So stigma came up quite a bit, particularly for our female participants. So this idea that to suggest that we need to use a condom or we need to get STI tests was saying either, again, that you don't trust that person or you think that they're loose, promiscuous, dirty, or that it's saying something about you and your own sexual practices. So as one example, one of our female participants was having a casual sexual encounter with a man, and she pulled some condoms out and he said, you know, what sort of woman carries condoms around? You must have slept with everyone. And of course, the classic complaint about condoms, that they reduce pleasure. And this came from male and female participants and probably doesn't warrant too much comments. So what sort of things facilitated the use of safer sex practices? So firstly, concern for personal health. So for participants who'd had STIs or been exposed to STIs, they were often had a more heightened awareness, I guess. We had one participant, for example, who had had a whole range of gynecological problems throughout her life and just said, I don't need an STI on top of that, you know. And I think just also this idea that, well, if we can prevent it, it makes sense, right? So this common sense approach. Again, new relationships and trust came into it. So new relationships were often a key point at which people would use condoms, but again, often in quite a perfunctory kind of way. Although interestingly, one participant spoke about how for her, going out and getting an STI test and sharing the results with a partner took a tremendous amount of trust and could actually be a way of building trust in a relationship. So we can perhaps harness trust there in a more productive kind of way. And finally, participants who'd been exposed to education and information about STIs also cited that as a reason for wanting to use safer sex practices. And perhaps most commonly, the Grim Reaper campaigns from the 1980s actually had an interesting influence on some of our participants. So I think that those findings tend to suggest that there might be some gaps there in terms of engaging in safer sex, and it also suggests that there might be a need for participants or older people to be seeking out sexual healthcare. So we wanted to know whether our participants spoke to healthcare providers about sex and sexual health, and how that went for them. So overwhelmingly, most of the interview participants didn't talk to their healthcare providers about sex, mostly because they thought that there was no need to. So one of our participants, Norman, said that his healthcare provider actually asked him quite regularly about sex and about his sex life, but they hadn't actually engaged in any discussion because that he felt that there hasn't been a problem. So for other participants, again, stigma came in here, so they didn't talk to their healthcare provider because they were embarrassed and they were worried about being judged. And again, this was particularly the case for our female participants. And most people also said that their healthcare provider did not actively try and initiate conversations with them about sexual health and sex. And participants had a range of theories about why this might be the case. So the first was ageism. So one of our participants, Xavier, said that he thought healthcare providers didn't ask him about sex because I'm old. And when you get to a certain age, people start thinking differently. It's really weird. A lot of people thought that their healthcare provider was embarrassed about it and actually didn't have the skills or the training to know how to initiate those conversations, and particularly with their older patients. And quite a few people said, oh, I haven't spoken to my healthcare provider about sex, but I reckon I'd be okay with it if I had to. So there were a smaller number who were comfortable and did talk to their healthcare providers about sex, and the relationship between the healthcare provider and the participant was really central in facilitating this. So one of our participants, Ivy, who said she felt really comfortable talking to her GP about sex, said that for her it's because she's been my doctor for 30 years. They were around the same age. They'd gone through things like pregnancy and menopause together. So she felt quite comfortable just asking her and just doing it or getting on with it. Having the need to get either an STI test or experiencing some kind of sexual difficulty also was another reason why participants would talk to a healthcare provider about these issues. So having, for example, erectile difficulty and wanting to have sex and not being able to kind of outweighed the perceived embarrassment and would enable participants to talk to their healthcare provider. So another small number of participants also said, well, I talked to my healthcare provider about sex, but I'm still pretty embarrassed about it, and it's not a comfortable experience. And again, this relationship between healthcare providers and participants was really central. So one of our participants, George, said, on a scale out of 10, I probably sit at around the 3 to 5 range in terms of his comfort. So he said that the GP that he has doesn't open up sexual discussion. He's not comfortable with it, whereas his old GP was comfortable with it and I could talk to him about anything. So the responses that participants had received from healthcare providers when they had talked about sexual health and sex were also quite mixed. So we did have some participants who had fantastic responses where their healthcare provider was really supportive, really matter-of-fact and professional about it. But we also had participants who had quite negative or stigmatizing responses. So one of our participants, Wilma, went to her GP for an STI test after she knew she'd been exposed to an STI, and he said to her, "Oh, I'm sure you're fine. You don't need to worry about it." So she was only tested because she absolutely insisted that she should be. Okay, so we also asked our participants about how, what can we do to best improve or support the sexual lives of older Australians? And this relates to virtually all of the sexual rights that I identified earlier. And I think it is vitally important that our efforts to support older people are embedded within their own expressed needs and ideas. So firstly, sexualities, education and resources for older people were really commonly mentioned. So this included both sort of general information about safer sex and STIs, but also a perceived need for resources that that target more to some of the changes that come with aging and how you might accommodate the changing bodies and within your sexual life. Unsurprisingly, given what we've just heard, training and education for healthcare providers was also really commonly mentioned. So again, this idea that healthcare providers just haven't been trained to work specifically with older patients around sexual health matters, and that they needed ongoing training as well and ongoing support. So shifting cultural norms was also a huge one. So as I mentioned earlier, there is this real populist assumption that sex doesn't happen once you hit a certain age, that it's not important anymore, but also that there's something a bit gross, about old people having sex. So a lot of people would talk about, oh, I mentioned to my kids that I've got a new partner, and they'd go, oh, I don't want to know about it. It's a bit icky. So having public education or campaigns that sort of aim to shift some of those ageist attitudes. And relatedly, changing media representations. This is one of the key ways in which our participants thought we could start to sort of shift those cultural assumptions. So having, television shows or movies that actually represent older people as sexual beings and in sexual relationships. And finally, aged care facilities were a really significant concern for a lot of our participants. So all of these interview participants were community dwelling, but they expressed a lot of anxiety and concern around, well, what happens in a few years' time if I need to go into a supported living environment? Will I be able to have any kind of sexual life? Certainly the perception that aged care facilities were not supportive of residents having any kind of sexual relationships, that they wouldn't have access to, condoms, to STI testing, that, you don't know if you're going to be able to have half an hour alone without someone barging into the room, and so forth. So certainly that was an area that they wanted to see addressed through policy and practice change. So I guess just to add to some of our participants' own suggestions for what we can do to support the sexual lives of older people. So I think firstly, the findings that we've presented here do perhaps suggest that the sexual rights of older Australians are not being fully actualised. And I don't want to suggest that everything is totally awful. In fact, for most of our participants, they were pretty happy about their sexual lives, but there are clearly some areas there, particularly around sexuality, education, access to sexual health care, where I think we can argue that their rights are not being fully afforded or actualised in practice. So what can we do to help support older people? So I think firstly, we do need to recognise the diversity in experience and desires of older people. So not all older people are interested in sex or place a really, strong importance on sex. So I think our responses need to be inclusive and supportive of this. So we certainly don't want to go down the other end of the spectrum and almost imply that there's something wrong with you if you're older and that you're not interested in sex anymore, or creating some kind of imperative to remain sexually active in later life. So I think there is a need to shift and open up our understandings of what counts as sex, and in particular to move away from some of these more heteronormative, youthful kind of norms that are constructing sex around penetration. So for some of our participants, these types of constructions of sex had quite serious implications in terms of their ability to obtain sexual pleasure when they can no longer engage in those types of sexual practices. And I think that this construction of sex arguably contravenes our right to pleasurable and satisfying sexual lives. And I would certainly argue that that is the case across the life course as well, not just for older people. We think there's a clear need for older Australians to be included within sexual health policy and practice. At the moment, they are totally excluded from sexual health policy in Australia. And again, this is not to suggest that we need to get every older person to have an STI test or anything like that. It is a particular part of the cohort, but we sort of need some inclusion as opposed to none that we see at the moment. And finally, we have to understand these experiences within a broader context of ageism and gender discrimination and inequality, and our efforts to improve sexual lives need to work alongside efforts to tackle these more structural and systemic inequalities. That's it, thank you. If anyone's Yeah, yes. Oh, sorry. So did participants talk, I've totally forgotten that already. Did participants talk at all about where they were looking for information? Yeah, they did. The two main ones were the internet and healthcare settings or healthcare providers. And most people were pretty discerning about their internet use. Not everyone, but most people were saying, I go to government websites or kind of like medical health or university kind of centres or whatever. It wasn't, whatever random thing that was on the internet. And yeah, healthcare providers were the other one, or the place that they would like to go to, given that most of them weren't actually actively utilising that as a source of information.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks very much to the Centre for inviting myself and Bianca to do this number, and also to thanks to Christy and Peter in particular for inviting me come along. This paper arises out of a number of previous research projects, which you can read for yourself. But I guess the main thing is that overall, the paper arises out of an interest in innovations in intimacy in modern life. So it's a general interest about innovations in intimacy, not just to do with older people. But I'm particularly interested in seeing whether there are any signs of advances of any kind in social justice and gender equality as part of that on the horizon in relation to sexual practices, because this could be a site of social change that could be quite important to us. And while this particular paper is focused on innovations in the new technologies of intimacy in Australian internet dating sites, I will make a passing mention to internet dating sites that we're researching also overseas. So the plan is to briefly, given the time limits, and I'll have to be yelled at, I'm sure, that I want to look briefly at the rationale for my concern with sexuality in discussions of older people, which crosses over with Bianca a bit too, and there's quite a few things that I think I see connections, and then I'll turn to the way that I've got the focus that I have, and then some possible research directions and policy directions that might derive from that approach, hopefully with a bit of a conclusion perhaps, although the conclusion might come from discussion afterwards. So as you're probably very well aware, and I'm sure this is a very well informed audience, so in some senses I don't need to say these things, but I will anyway. There is a link, a very strong link, in lots of research on sexual health and overall well-being. The connection is really strong, well established. So the global study of sexual attitudes and behaviours, which involved a sample of men and women aged between 40 and 80 from about 29 countries, found that over 3/4 of their participants agreed that satisfactory sex, now of course we don't know what that might mean, but whatever it meant for those people, satisfactory sex was essential to a maintenance of relationships and was also seen as very important to their overall sense of health and well-being. And a wide range of studies from a whole range of countries reiterate that sexual expression is not just one of those optional extras that's a nice little fun thing, but was actually seen by a great number of people as an essential aspect of their lives, and one that was predictive of a higher quality of life. Now that kind of gets to be important with a few bits of other information. And so, as Barrett notes, there's a significant body of evidence which links sexual health to emotional well-being of older people. That'll come as no surprise, I'm sure, to any of you, including those who are not older. But despite that, very few health or human service organisations have programs which will support the sexual health of older clients, which is the kind of thing Bianca's been talking about. But given the opportunity, and there's a lot of research on this, older people, when asked themselves about the importance of sexuality, do see it as very much concerned with living well. So in one woman participant in a study by Sue Malta, who I took as kind of quite appropriate, and Sue Malta was in the group that you were talking about before, she says, I can hardly walk, there's nothing like a romp in bed to make me feel alive, which I think sums it up rather well. So that's... I don't think I should add more than that, really. So, but I would just add to that rationale, that broad rationale, that desire for, as you've heard already, desire for sexual intimacy amongst older people is very frequently ignored, dismissed, or more often not acknowledged at all. And often older people in institutional, dependent older people in institutional care are very typically, and I've done quite a bit of research on aged facilities, so I can certainly back up Bianca's point, are typically offered no privacy at all, no double beds. Suddenly when you get past a certain age, you can't have a double bed. You go back to being a kid and being in a single bed, no matter what your health status, quite often. No opportunities for pleasure or flirting or privacy or dating or romance or sex, let alone health benefits in relation to possible STIs or whatever. The lack of attention to older people's sexuality is, I think, really summed up in those aged care facilities. That's what is thought, I think, in a general way, and I think it's very telling. I'd also say the lack of attention to older people's sexuality is also evident in the medical information that they receive, or rather don't receive. For example, just as a kind of aside to the sort of thing that was mentioned before, the Australian National Stroke Foundation audit on whether people were given information about the impact on their sexuality after a stroke found that only 12% had received any information on that subject at all, and yet it would have quite an impact on one's life. In short, I'd like to draw attention, I suppose, to the practical reality that we're faced with today. I'm not going to be as positive as Bianca, I'm going to be negative. The practical reality, I think, that the institutional and medical care involves all sorts of sexualities and intimacies and so on, but that nevertheless that's often evaded in medical, institutional and care settings for older people, and that's widespread. It's not just the occasional bad apple who isn't interested or makes you feel embarrassed, but it's much broader than that. And that desexualised framing of intimacy and care amongst older people suggests that we do need new policies, new approaches, new terminologies, new theories. We have to do something. For obvious reasons, there are getting to be more of us. But because I'll include myself now, I can include myself in the numbers. The last couple of years, I can say I'm part of it. That's, I think, a really important and quite an urgent matter. So what's my central focus? The focus in this paper on the issue of sexuality amongst older people is in relation to the specific instance of internet dating. So I'm going to take that as my illustrative example of some points I want to make about a general thing to do with sexuality in older people. Why did I choose that focus? Well, first of all, let's just quickly, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but just in case you're not, internet dating is characterised as a purposeful form of meeting new people through specifically designed internet sites. It's a relatively new phenomenon, so it's quite an interesting thing to think about, with the net being established, I suppose, broadly in the 1990s and commercial dating sites not long after that. These sites do make use of new technology and they do vary in how they operate, but they broadly use very similar principles to the previous sort of newspaper personal ads that used to exist, or agencies or other older forms of matchmaking. And on the other hand, this is a new technology, and it seems to me that it's worthwhile to have a look at new ways of undertaking intimacy, because there might be some novel possibilities going on here. We want to see what's happening with older people. Internet dating, as you probably know, is increasingly a much more popular means of undertaking social connection than it has been, and it's increasingly a form that's employed not just by young people, but by all age groups. Moreover, the number of older people that are making use of internet dating as a means to undertake intimate relationships of some sort is increasing worldwide. Indeed, it's been claimed that adults aged 60 and older represent the largest growing segment of adults using online dating sites. So actually the older people are becoming kind of this growing number, quite an important force in this field. So of course definitions of what is older differ. Some people will say 50, some people will say, I've even seen 45, depends on your point of view, I suppose. Some people, so, there you go. Some people say over 70, it's very variable. But whatever your definition, nevertheless, internet dating is more and more widely used by older people, and it's undoubtedly of more increasing social significance. I think that's particularly true, not just because older people are using that particular mode of developing intimate relationships more, but also because, as we're widely known, we know that that older people are becoming a larger number of people. 25% of the Australian population will be aged over 75 in 2051, it is predicted. Now that's a really significant cohort. I'm not saying that even if it was a small cohort, we shouldn't take any notice, but clearly that is going to be some importance. But I want to add to that, not just growing numbers of older people, whatever your definition, but according to the World Health Organization, we have not only the sheer rising number of older people, but a rising number of single older people. So the question of intimate relationships is quite, finding intimate partners becomes perhaps ever more significant. And at the same time, a parallel increase in people living longer. So a lot more of us, the older ones, a lot more singles, and living for longer periods where you could be lonely, basically, or not in a partnership if you wish to be in one. Not that everybody necessarily wants to be. No wonder then that contemporary technologies of intimacy are assuming a more and more significant place in social life, both locally and internationally. So the focus that I'm taking for this paper is chosen because of the growing significance of internet dating, and specifically the growing importance of it for older people. But even though that's true, the literature on the subject is really very limited indeed. It's quite surprising how limited it is. You'd think, older people are such a big market. You'd think people would be rushing in to do this research, but it's apparently not. First of all, there is, I think, as has been pointed out very clearly before, there's a broad inclination to shy away from discussing sexuality per se in public policy. I think that's initially a difficulty. That's exacerbated in the case of older people because, and that is, I think, related to widespread ageism, usually combined with couple-centrism and heterosexism. Can you have couple-centrism? You know what I mean. So that ageism is certainly evident in the assumption that older people are not sexual, or that sexual expression amongst older people is problematic or strange or even a bit unseemly, the point Bianca made before. Icky, I think, was the professional term. Denmark notes that one of the most pervasive myths in our society is the belief that there is a decrease in sexual interest and a diminished capacity for sexual behaviour as being an intrinsic part of the ageing process, that's just what happens. But rather than older age being inevitably constituted as sexless, even if certain practices change or move around, people like Malta's study, her study, suggest that Australian older participants, 60 to 92, in internet dating were actually more sexually overt than those who were younger. Interesting, like, okay. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And moreover, although we have to wonder about this material, but I think it's worth taking seriously, the RSVP Date of the Nation report of 2012, 2014 and so on, and remember RSVP being the biggest internet site in Australia, confirmed after a series of surveys, usually around 3,000 people, that Australian singles over 51, you see the age thing moving around, but never mind, is the most likely age group to have sex on the first date. So there. So they're more inclined to leap into it, and they're more inclined to leap in it on the first date. So much for being sexless. So we have that, that concern about not understanding what might be going on for some people. But the ageism in the existing literature is also reflected in the assumption that older people are necessarily technophobic and have little knowledge or skill or interest in new technologies, rather than they might need to update their skill set. The assumption is they're just they're frightened and don't want to do it, they're never doing it. But according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we ought to think about that one again too. The number of older people accessing the internet is increasing very steadily, and once they shift to online activity, then they use it as much, they're as engaged as young people are. So it may take a little bit longer, but they're not necessarily disinterested or technophobic. So we have these ageist assumptions in relation to both sexuality and technology combining to produce an almost exclusive focus on internet dating studies on the young. So there's very little material. I mean, whatever your definition of older, nevertheless, the material that's around almost always talks about young people. Furthermore, to the extent that studies of older people do exist in the literature, there's not much research outside of the United States. That's where it tends to be located. And when there is research, it tends to focus on risks and STIs. Watch out, you older people. You know, it tends to be very negative, you know. Ooh. It's not, that's what the research is about. It's not about, ooh, that's an interesting thing that the people are doing. It's, you know, oh, they're getting more diseases. You know, and I'm not suggesting that isn't worth thinking about, obviously, but it does seem to me that when that is the focus, you've got to ask about this. There's a slightly punitive element in it. Anyway, there is a restricted attention, in other words, to meanings and to positive social directions, as well as very limited qualitative work or analysis of values and practices, which I think is pretty important given the numbers of people we're talking about. The issue of the extent to which internet dating represents opportunities for social innovation in relation to sexual citizenship, or the extent to which it is not an opportunity for innovation, has been raised in some literature, not much. However, when people do try to go, oh, you know, I wonder whether there's anything innovative or not innovative in this material, in this these practices, mostly what the analyses do is look at it in narrow technical terms. That is, they talk in technicist ways about, oh, these older people now have more choices, more numbers of choice because of the algorithms which give them more matched partners. So it seems to be in that technicist way, not talking about the meaning of what's going on. Moreover, the analysis is narrow in other ways too. Usually it's at the kind of discussion at the level of individual interactions. You know, this person found this and this person found. It's very individualised, and the discussion of the benefits or otherwise of internet dating is often based on very normative assumptions about gender and about sexual practice, which, you know, reflects some of the difficulty in the research that Bianca has pointed out in her participants. So I think that there are reasons why we want to think about this question in more interesting ways. Surely it is quite significant to think about this in terms of potential directions in social life, in modernity. Older people aren't not part of modernity, they are shaping modernity too. So this is something to do with social change, and quite an important area, I think. But also we need to think about it in practical terms, in policy terms, in terms of the development of institutional facilities and services for older people, so that practical sense as well. So in that context, my approach is to foreground the question today about whether internet dating might provide opportunities for progressive social change. In terms of, in particular, I'm going to have to focus, because this is where most of the material is, does it provide opportunities for advancing gender equity between heterosexuals? Because that was mostly where we did the research. We had some difficulty, different kinds of internet dating sites when you're talking about non-heterosexual possibilities. So the work tended to focus on this larger body of material. So possible directions. Of course, it could be the case that internet dating is not a site for exciting, normative, innovative possibilities. It could be so. Technological innovation, of course, does not necessarily mean social innovation. You know, if you have what is the thing that picks up wheat? Ooh. But it can't move away too far. You know the thing, the wheat reaper thingy? You know, the development of... Thank you. Doesn't necessarily mean that there was much social change out in the boondocks where I was brought up. So technological innovation doesn't necessarily mean social innovation. We know that. But there are signs, and there are signs too, I think, in our material, that the intransigent attachments to particular ways of forming intimacy, such as romantic meeting ups, can be quite stereotypic, if you like. In that line, one heterosexual female participant comment, "You might think online dating would create a much needed fairness between the sexes, but in the realm of hetero courtship, tradition still reigns supreme. Every day when I log on to that dating site of my choice, I play the passive role, the receiver of attention, the awaiter of messages." So she's saying, doesn't look like much is changing. Additionally, as you may be aware, there's been a recent spate of horrified discussion about the Canadian-based Ashley Martin internet dating site, which caters for those who wish to develop secret affairs. We're not talking small numbers. In Britain, on this site alone, there were 1.2 million users of such a site. It's only one place, they're all over the place. The company gained a lot of media attention, of course, in 2015 when hackers stole some of its customer data and made some of it public for all sorts of reasons. This kind of site appears to provide a service almost exclusively for men and for men who are married or in a committed relationship. And in this sense, I guess you could say it does seem to simply reproduce existing gendered sexual hierarchies and practices that reproduce the authority of the masculine norm in certain ways. So it doesn't look very, innovative, I must say. In my research also with co-writers in Uganda, Sweden, Denmark, UK and Australia, we also noted the profiles that you have to put up to make yourself interesting, which is usually a description of yourself and a picture, pictures being of various kinds, is very commonplace. We noted in doing a random sample in all those countries that there were very commonplace for older heterosexual men to describe themselves and to offer visuals to support that, which reinforced traditional masculine stereotypes like me with car, me with motorbike, me with boat. You get the picture. But on the other hand, there are, I think, some possible signs of in favour of innovation in various ways. And I'll just want to briefly sum those up. I don't know how I'm going to time. 10 minutes, great. Good. Yes, good. First of all, as a whole range of writers have said, older people are often disregarded when we talk about social change and social innovation. But older people may actually, against the grain, sometimes provide unexpected examples of being in the vanguard of social change. And I will try to explain what I mean. As they experience ageism, suddenly entitled older men may experience being in a different place. Their bodies, everybody's bodies are changing, and suddenly all sorts and that affects both older women and older men about their sense of themselves and what their choices are. And in that process, as I think Bianca described very beautifully, older heterosexual partners may not begin to fit into normative expectations, like men being always sexually commanding or something, or penis-vagina sex being, the ultimate or the only sexual choice that you might have available to you. In that novel terrain, you may find that older people are willing and interested in a whole range of things that they weren't interested in before. Human beings are capable of being quite flexible, I think, when things change for them. And the novel terrain of internet dating seems to produce, I think, some changes. Wouldn't want to make too much of it, but I think there are some possibilities here. And, I was talking, rudely about the boat and the motorbike and so on. But at the same time, I would also say that on those online dating sites, what we noticed was absolutely overwhelming, was that older heterosexual men were also presenting themselves not just with the boat, but also saying that they were very much at pains to describe themselves in various ways as easygoing, not controlling. You can make your choices too. That kind of way of describing themselves, which to me suggested, and to all of us in our different countries, suggested to us that there was some kind of reworking of masculine practice, which was not unimportant. It was about saying, I know you've got choices too, and we might have to talk about some sort of equitable kind of relationship. And I'm not assuming I'm going to be in charge. That's what I think was very interesting, even if they had the boat or the whatever. So, does age interact with new technologies to enable more possibilities? Perhaps they're less sensational than real big changes, but they may be nevertheless significant. Social change in intimacy is perhaps slow and not so easily seen. Just some examples. One evident practice that is an example of an innovation, you may decide you have different views about it, but is mundane polyamory. What I mean by that is dating several people at once is very frequent and indeed comparatively easy in internet dating, available to both older heterosexual men and women. And it's very evident that everyone knows that there's that possibility. This is much, much more difficult in offline encounters, as I'm sure you're all aware. There are regular comments by internet dating users indicating they can and they do talk and meet with several potential partners, often over quite long periods of time, but varied periods of time, so they can sort out what they want to do. And sometimes they don't sort it out, they just keep going. So internet dating sites, and I think it's really important to note this, are precisely set up for multiple partnership possibilities, multiple connections of varying levels. Second, so that's a change. You're suddenly in a different kind of flowing situation, which does, I think, have some potential for intimacy. It changes the nature of the power relations. Secondly, while older people generally, and older women in particular, are normatively viewed in desexualised ways, and often their sexuality is seen as undesirable, they appear in some of the internet research we've done, especially older heterosexual women, to take up many more opportunities for casual sex. So that's interesting. And with sex with a much wider variety of age groups, usually something we associate with traditional masculinity. Thirdly, both men and women are placed in positions where they can peruse a wide variety of partners, and both men and women, heterosexual men and women, know that that's so. And they are aware of it and comment on it. So they know that, if you're a man, you know very well that the women you're looking at or interested in are also looking at other possibilities too. So it's not a level playing field. I'd never want to go that far, but I do think it's a different playing field than the offline in certain ways, at least for a period, I suppose. Fourthly, the thing that comes up in lots of stuff on dating and intimate relations over and over again is the tendency of heterosexuals to get into homologous relationships, people like themselves, having relationships with people like yourselves. Internet dating spreads that out a bit. There's less parochial. People describe quite commonly being willing to try a greater variety because they're able to, and they meet people that they would never meet in their ordinary lives, and that there opens up those homologous possibilities, non-homologous possibilities. Now, of course, a lot of these non-normative innovations may be temporary, they might be contingent, and they may not result in ongoing practice. But I still think that they may promote or invoke modes of sexual intimacy that have political meaning and that are of interest in terms of us thinking about social change. And if so, there are some likely policy, institutional, social and theoretical implications in this work. So finally, sexuality, I know that's a very undiverse image, it's all very soppy. It's hard to find pictures of older people that aren't soppy, I'll tell you. Anyway, sexuality is, you've got to end with a happy note, don't you? Sexuality is frequently unrecognised and under-theorised in social research. I think that's, first of all, I think it's hard to do work in this field without people asking you why, or wondering why. Which is interesting. I focus upon the instance of internet dating as a means to reconsider the importance of sexuality in social life and to think of it in terms of its meaning in social change, which I think is under-referenced. And I also think that if in analysing social change, it's possible to think about the ways in which internet dating might be normative in lots of ways, but it may also suggest some heterodox innovations which are politically and practically significant. I've tried to sketch up just a few, and I'm sure you can think of more. This research terrain, because it's relatively in its infancy, needs a lot more empirical work, which I'm part of undertaking. Such research, I think, promises something interesting, that to show that older people's lives that they're not passive subjects, that they're not passive recipients of care, but they are contributing actively to the development of social life and social change. It's possible to imagine, when you look at this research, that older people might actually be doing sex in more intimacy, in more interesting ways than younger people who are very much controlled by the requirement to fulfil certain gender stereotypes. Older people, if you ask them, might actually be doing a greater range of things than younger people. So, thank you.
question was about, did we identify disability and how did that impact on the findings? So we didn't talk about it in the interviews, and nobody self-identified as living with disability. We did have a few people talk about having quite debilitating illness, so usually like cancer, for example. And to be honest, I can't remember what we asked in the survey. I'm fairly certain that we did ask questions about health and disability, but I don't know what the findings are from that. So sorry, that's not a very satisfactory answer. But yeah, and again, I think there's, as you've kind of just pointed out, Chris, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in this area. And I think looking at some of those intersections between things like disability, but also like race and cultural background. Almost all of our sample were white Australians. Most of our participants were heterosexual. So we could really only skim the surface around a lot of those intersectional issues.
I do in other circumstances, not in relation to this, but I know her quite well. But I guess one of the things that really, I would say that the stuff we looked at, people did talk about disability, and that was one of the ones where breaking down homologous ideas about relationships, where that did come up, where people mentioned, because they were sometimes ill, or they had some, or they may have had disabilities for life, and that those things became seen differently as people got older. It was quite interesting that was. I mean, it wasn't big numbers, in any of the samples we looked at. But I would say that was one instance where people became less parochial, and it was also a means by which people with mobility disabilities, particularly, had suddenly had a much wider range of people to talk to, and so on. So there were options opened both for them and that they could embark upon. I mean, I'm not making that a bit too all gorgeous, but it did seem to me that there were some opportunities there. Yeah, or at least they were said to be so.
Yeah, so we did actually try to actively recruit LGBT older people, and we don't know why we were unsuccessful in that. So the study was led through Archers at La Trobe University, which is one of the biggest research centres on LGBT plus Australians. So we had all the networks and things in place, but just didn't recruit them. Certainly for lesbian women and same-sex attracted women, we did have people comment that they felt the survey was really not inclusive of them, even though we had thought that and had consulted with all the relevant people. They felt really excluded by it. So maybe the SDI focus seemed to somehow shut at least some groups within those broad communities out. But otherwise, we don't know, because we honestly did try to recruit a diverse population. Yeah, exactly. And sorry, do you want to come in?
I was just going to come in on that and say we thought about having several internet dating sites, but we did notice, and this was a pilot, and we had to get the material done in a year, and we felt that we couldn't do justice because they were so different. My sense was I was quite interested in doing that. So other people in the team thought it would just be too much, because we thought we would have to do we'd have to do lesbian sites, we'd have to do gay men's sites, because they were not the same, and you couldn't even. So I think that's one of those areas which definitely needs work.
Yeah, and there definitely were very different experiences particularly for the gay men that we had in our sample, who had been much more exposed to sexual health information, obviously largely because of the AIDS epidemic. They had a very different experience of sexual health testing, knowledge, things that were targeted towards them compared to all of our other participants. Actually, not as much as we thought we were going to. The main one was that issue around stigma, where women were much more on the receiving end of these, very judgmental attitudes around, particularly around condom use and safer sex and what counts as being promiscuous. That was the biggest difference, because in terms of things like definitions of sex, like both men and women like fell into those kind of hierarchical or fluid categories, similar kind of variations in terms of how important sex was to them and all that kind of stuff, which we weren't expecting. Like, I thought we were going to see very distinct gender divides. So I don't know whether it's something to do with the particular sample that we recruited, or if we just need to speak to a bigger group of people. But yeah, there actually wasn't as much of a gender divide as I was certainly assuming that there might be, which was interesting. So I don't know why, really why that was the case. Yeah.